my part of this session is to talk about the view of the association. And usually this would have been done by Helen McAteer, who's the Chief Executive of the Psoriasis Association, but she's on leave, which is why I've agreed to do this in her absence. And I'm grateful to her and to Rhiannon for the preparation of these slides. And I hope I will speak to them and do them justice. So next, if you can click on for me. So why does it matter? Well, it matters. We want good applications. We want to fund high quality research. So we want you to provide us with an application which is good enough that we can fund your work so that we can improve treatment and support for people with psoriasis and psoriatic arthropathy to a degree, but there are separate associations, and in the Q&A it's possible that people will want to understand a little bit better about our links with the psoriasis, psoriatic arthropathy side of things as well. But the bottom line is the organisation is all about trying to reduce the impact of psoriasis on individuals and the wider society. So I would ask you, when you're doing your application, to think about how can I be making a difference here to patients and to people with psoriasis. That's fundamentally what our association is about. Next slide, Rhiannon. So who are we? We were established by a very forward-thinking dermatologist in 1968, Dick Coles, a consultant dermatologist in Northampton, and we couldn't believe, I'm sure he wouldn't believe how far we've come since he set up this association. It's a charity. We are a charity. We're completely reliant on donations to fund our work, but the organisation has really mushroomed and developed since it was first established in 1968 in Northampton. Our aims are raising awareness of psoriasis and supporting people impacted by psoriasis, and a lot of that we do through our team at our small team at the office in Northampton. We have a very big social media presence now. We have a very active website, which I suspect many of you will have looked at. We have Instagram, Facebook, and all sorts of ways that we communicate with people. We used to be completely a membership organisation, but we've now expanded out using social media to try and reach out more to raise awareness and to support people impacted with psoriasis. But the reason you're here today is in relation to research. So our first research grant was awarded in 1971 to Professor Terence Ryan for the purchase of a centrifuge and a thermostatic water bath. And since then, we have spent around £6 million on research. So we are proper people who want to fund decent research. These are reasonable sums of money. We're not like the really big grant award giving organisations, but we do take this very seriously. Next slide. So our first PhD studentship was awarded in 2007, and interestingly, it was awarded to a student that was being supervised by Professor Francesca Capone at King's College London. And it was entitled The Role of Genes Predisposing to Epithelial Inflammation in the Pathogenesis of Psoriasis. And many of you will know that Francesca Capone is a really leading light in academic psoriasis research, and we're delighted to be congratulating her on being promoted to a professor in August of this year. Since that first PhD was awarded in 2007, we've awarded 28 more, and this is a key plank of our research strategy that we will continue to fund PhD studentships, and it's across a range of areas, and this is important for you. It's basic science, epidemiology and psychology. It's different types of psoriasis, and it's all about treatments and lifestyle factors, and I'll cover that a little bit more when we talk about the priority setting partnership, which influences our research priorities. But you know, anything to do with psoriasis, basically we are interested in funding good PhD studentships. Our grant call has just opened and it will close on the 1st of December. The total award is for £92,000, which is split into 3 equal payments across the 3 years of the grant award. Next slide, Rhiannon. So I've already said that we are going to fund research into the causes, treatment and care of psoriasis and factors affecting quality of life. Different types of psoriasis, comorbidities that are linked to psoriasis, we've also funded previously and will continue to fund those. The applications, and Nick is going to talk more about what he's going to be looking for in applications and that side of things and give you some tips, but they are obviously going to be judged on scientific merit and feasibility. Applicants must be employed by a recognised research centre within the UK, and it's going to be really, really important for you to show us that if you're applying for one of these PhD studentships, it needs to be in a good teaching environment. I want to stress the importance of two aspects to the review process. Since 2017, we now have an experts by experience committee, the so-called exec. So all of your applications will be looked at the lay committee or the exec. Who are the people on the exec? Well, they are people that have lived experience of psoriasis. So these will be people, for example, who may have psoriasis themselves, or they may have members of their family, or they may be caring for people with psoriasis. There are 10 members of the exec committee, and currently we do have some vacancies on that committee that we're recruiting to. They serve a term of maybe 1, 2 or 3 years, but all of them will review one round of PhD applications, and their scores are taken very seriously. So it's very important that you recognise the significant lay involvement in this review process. They don't have to be members of the Psoriasis Association, they just have to have lived experience of the condition. So they will do their reviewing, and then the Medical and Research Committee, on which Nick and I sit, we will do our own review process as well. And we also have some external peer reviewers that we ask to review specific bids if it's in a specific area where we want some external comments. So it is a very robust process in terms of this review process, but I cannot stress enough the importance of the lay element to it. Next slide, Rhiannon. So what you must be aware of as well, and what is really, really important, and you should be familiar with before you submit your bid, is you should understand what the Psoriasis Priority Setting Partnership Top 10 research priorities are. This PSP, as it's called, was funded by the Psoriasis Association in 2016. It was led by Dr. Helen Young at the University of Manchester, and it used the principles of a James Lind Alliance PSP, which brings together clinicians, patients and carers to identify what are the most important outstanding research questions. And all of your applications must seek to address at least one of these top 10 research priorities that were identified by the PSP. And I'm just going to list them in the next 2 slides. So next slide, Rhiannon. So you can read these, and certainly outside of the meeting and ahead of putting in your applications, one would expect you to have read and to understand these. The things that I pick out from number 1 is diet, dietary supplements, alcohol, smoking. What about lifestyle factors? That was number 1. If we treat psoriasis early, does it reduce the severity of disease? What factors is there some research that we could have that would understand how well psoriasis will respond to certain treatments? Something about symptoms. What's the best way to treat some of the symptoms? And it's really great to have Rachel and from Chris Bundy's team, because we are really interested to know about psychological interventions, but what about educational interventions for adults and children with psoriasis? Next slide. The number 6 is about the link with other diseases and other health conditions such as cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome. An understanding for number 7, why do some treatments stop working? And what's the best way to get your disease controlled? What are the genetic factors that are relevant? And is a person with psoriasis more likely to develop other health conditions? And if so, which ones? And what's the best way to treat sudden flares? So we've got 10 priorities there. And what we would be really looking for, number 1 thing when we're considering your application is which one of the one or more, just, ideally it would be more than one, which one or more of these does your bid match to in terms of our research priorities? Next slide, Rhiannon. So finally, that's given you an overview of my take on this on behalf of Helen and the association, and as a trustee, but also as a patient advocate and a consultant dermatologist. I think the final point I would just make before I hand over to Nick is that the layperson is very much at the centre of our process. I've already indicated the review process with the exec and the final decision making with the trustees. We would expect any application to describe how you're going to communicate the findings of the research project and how you think that will implement changes and make a difference to people. All of our funding, as I said, is through donations, so we have to be minded that we are spending precious money that has been donated to us. And finally, I would just stress the importance that you need to be linking into the research priorities that were identified by the James Lind PSP. I'll hand over now to Nick.
Yeah, thanks very much, Julia. So for those of you who've not been, this is a picture of Newcastle in a sunny summer's evening, and we're very famous for our bridges as well as some of the architecture that's developed along the Tyne over the last few years. And in fact, we had the BSID here this year and held the dinner on top of the art gallery, which is shown in the foreground there. Next slide, please. So going back to the importance of patients, Lucy Chappell, who's now Chief Executive of the NIHR, has stressed the importance of a research circle. And this really relates to translational research and how ideas build to give you a research hypothesis. You develop a proposal, you may then do some research in a laboratory or in a very defined clinical setting, and then you go back to the patients and you ask them how this is impacted on their thinking about the disease, and in the end you hope that you're going to be able to influence outcomes for your patient group, which in this particular instance obviously is the Psoriasis Association and its patients. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you, actually, if you just go back, I'm just going to, yeah, so I'm going to kind of focus really here on the importance of training, because this isn't a project grant and you have to consider you're applying to increase the critical mass of researchers in an important field, and we hope that the people we train will remain interested, as I have done for many years, having had some initial input into this important area of research. I'm going to talk about what the panel looks for, some top tips, and in the end you need to start thinking about the impact of your research on patients. And some of what I'm saying relates to many different grants, and there's a skill in learning to write grants. And I remember when I started to write them, I was very grateful for those mentors who took time to advise me how to amend and craft a grant so that it was effective. Sometimes you get caught up in your own idea to such a degree you need to stand back and, as Julia said, make sure it's understandable from a non-expert perspective, because we do get a very wide range of applications from very high level basic science through to epidemiology and some degree of clinical study. So we do have to have quite a big range of the panel with expertise in these different areas. So in the end, it's often the clarity of what you've written that will persuade the panel that yours idea is better and deserves funding compared to others in a competitive area. Next slide then, please. So please feel free to ask questions as we go through. This is very informal, and some of this is fairly obvious, but again, I think it's worth stating, because sometimes people just get very keen on their idea and just write it straight down and then don't stand back and consider it. So when you're writing your grant, you have to bring out some of these factors. It isn't just I'm going to write my idea down and the panel will like it or not. It's a question of persuading the panel through the way that you've constructed your arguments and the narrative. And you have to say that this is why it has scientific merit, why it's important, and why it's important to psoriasis patients. And again, if you stand back, you clearly need to have done a literature review. When you're reviewing many of these applications, it's always a bit infuriating to say, well, the PhD student will do a systematic review on day one. Well, actually, I think it's part of the role of the applicants to have considered the field, to consider whether there's similar research going on in different centres around the world, and that you can demonstrate that your idea is novel, innovative, and represents high quality research, which is what we want to support. So those are the general points. Stand back and look about what's going on. Make sure you do a proper literature search, and think about why your area is novel, and not just an extension of things going on. I think there's a question from somebody.
Stephanie, do you want to?
Steph.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the systematic reviews. I mean, it makes complete sense that we would do a review before submitting a PhD proposal. But PhD students in their first year have to do a review anyway. So it's kind of beneficial for us as supervisors to have it published. So my question is, we want students to be publishing all the research that they do, but we don't want it to seem in the application like we haven't actually looked over the evidence. How do you work with that?
Well, I think you're right. It's a question. That's what I'm saying. It's a question of crafting the application to get those points across. But I would also, I mean, again, it depends on the field that you're in. But if you're going to be doing fast-moving laboratory research, then in general, that's not doing a systematic review isn't terribly helpful. It can detract from learning the actual techniques that you need to be delivering, and then the field is moving very quick. So the systematic review will be out of date. So you're right. We try and it's good to look for some quick wins in your publication strategy, but it can often be quite cumbersome to do a fully fledged systematic review, which has now become a science in its own way. So yeah, I think it's a balancing act.
I would agree. I think it is a balancing act. I think, Steph, what we're getting at is that there's a huge frustration with some applications. We'll be considering them. I'll think it's a great application, and somebody like Nick or Chris Griffiths or Jonathan Barker, who on the committee, will say, but this piece of work's being done, or somebody else has already started this. Isn't this going on somewhere else? And I think that's what probably Nick is getting at, is make sure that you've not just decided to do something that someone else is already way down the road with. And I think that's more what I see it as, Nick, rather than a fully fledged piece of, not a complete systematic review, but certainly a really, really good understanding of the literature and what's going on and who's doing what work where.
Yeah, and I think if you can demonstrate you're an expert relative to your career stage in a particular area, then you will know what's going on. And it's a question of getting that across. So again, there's an art to this. You can't, again, if you write, I'm the international expert in so well, people want some evidence for it, So there is a careful way of showing subtly that you really know what's going on in the field, and that you've made the right collaborations. That is crucial, which I'll come to.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Okay, Steph, are you happy?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
So now we come down to some of the technical things, and again, this depends a bit on which field you're in. But for any of the fields, whether we're doing psychology or single cell sequencing, then we want to make sure that you've thought about the research question and you're bringing the relevant methodology to bear. So, for example, if you're now doing analysis of expression data, to say you're going to use an expression array, which is kind of 10 years old technology, wouldn't really persuade the committee that you're at the cutting edge of your field. So you need to make sure that it is relevant. And we're very conscious that that you've got to be a PhD student coming in from an undergraduate or master's level, are relatively junior. They won't be very experienced, and so we look to be, again, as we'll come to, that the training to support them is there, when they're in the right environment, there's other people working in the field with you, and that it's realistic. That you don't set them what you would set your postdoc to do in 3 years, because they need to be trained and they need to feel that they're supported. And you also have to think about any project design. If A depends on B, which depends on C, what happens if A doesn't work? If you say I'll build on the results of A and then I'll do experiment B, and actually A fell apart, well, then your whole project is at risk. So in general, it's not a good idea to have a very linear model like that, where you really do depend on the next results to prosecute aims 2 and 3. And if you do, then you need to have a contingency plan, because otherwise we'll think the project is too risky for the student. And there's nothing worse than having a student who's frustrated at the progress because the project was ill thought through. Next slide, please. I've already mentioned the importance of training environment, and these days it isn't just about the training environment in your own department, it's about the ethos in the institution, to look at what formal courses are available, what support is available for students. Are they going to have a rich environment that is going to excite them about continuing in science, when we know that it's a competitive job market? And again, I would say be very clear about the deliverables and the timelines, for everyone's benefit. If you do more, everyone's delighted, aren't they? But if you try and cram too much in, people will say, well, that's just not going to happen within this time frame. And I think the other thing you can talk about is we do work in a collaborative environment these days. So people can join larger projects, but you've then got to be very clear about what is the defined role of the student project compared to the larger project, because then again it shows this critical mass and other people to support them during that. And we're all aware that senior staff, whether they be academic staff or consultants, are extremely busy, so they look to see who's going to give immediate support during day to day, particularly if you're running a lab project. Are the postdocs in the lab who can help, if the techniques don't work or the cell culture becomes a problem.
Nick, can I just add something there in terms of timelines? I find this, you've talked there about the lab and the scientific stuff. The thing that I get bothered about is recruitment and numbers of patients that are going to be recruited, and where those patients are going to be recruited from as well. That's really, really important, because if you're going to need a certain number of patients or people with psoriasis and you're going to recruit them over a certain period of time, you need to be absolutely clear that you know where those patients will be recruited from. You need to have developed those links with clinical departments so that you're sure you're going to be able to recruit. Wouldn't you agree, Nick, that quite often we see expectations of recruitment that don't match to what we think is possible? I don't know whether you would agree.
No, absolutely. I think we often see that. I'll come to this again, that I mean, the panel is also conscious that it's getting harder to get funding, so having a fully funded studentship is quite attractive. So we often see people who clearly not worked on psoriasis before, thinking this is an exciting opportunity. And we have to be a little bit circumspect and make sure they are connected to departments and collaborations that will mean that they can deliver. So, you know, it's great if for example, a rheumatology PI decides that what they've found in their disease may be applicable to psoriasis. We would look at that and welcome the idea, but then we want to be convinced that they have access to the relevant expertise in patients, and that, you know, they've dealt with PPIE, that the patients are embedded, and that there's a communication plan back to the psoriasis patients. So you know,
Vasilis has put a very sensible question, which you may be going to cover, Nick, which is around should we be showing links with clinical sites in the application as part of the recruitment process?
Absolutely. Otherwise, we won't think it's credible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we would expect them to be, you know, formal collaborators. I mean, I think you can't, you know, if you're not in, you know, and again, we welcome applications, for example, on psychology. But if the department is not linked to a department, so we're going to recruit from Hospital X, and they don't show that there's any connection with Hospital X, then we're not going to think that that's credible. You can't just say, you know, we'd like 100 patients to study, please, thank you very much. You know, you have to do that with the department.
Thanks, Vasilis.
And in the end, you know, we do want the results communicated back to the community, so that's why we ask for a communication plan. Next slide, please. So some of this then is just those kind of very clear objectives put around the other ways to reinforce some of the points I've already made. But we're after clarity of thought, clarity of expression. So you do need to make it very clear what you think the project's going to involve, what the aims and objectives are. And again, it depends on the field, but if we're, you know, is there a hypothesis underlying the rationale behind this work? There often is, and we'd like it clearly spelled out. And then, you know, Julie's already been through the 10 research priorities, which I think are pretty broad, and I think you shouldn't have difficulty fitting research into one of them. I would say that each of the priorities in itself is like a program grant of research. To deliver it, you would need several people over a number of years. So you can't possibly aim for a student who's being trained to be able to tell you that the whole outcomes of what foods are going to be able to influence the disease course and your disease flares, because it simply won't be feasible. But within that particular example, you should be able to define a niche question that relates to the overarching umbrella question that you're trying to deal with. Next slide, please. And we've already touched on this, but it is important that you say and write why your research is important, not just because you think it's a great idea, and why it will be suitable for a PhD student. We're also not keen on funding recycled project grants that have been sent to the MRC and rejected because they're not always suitable for a PhD student, because they would depend on a level of expertise and that can easily be spotted by us. So you've really got to think about honing it to what's going to be done by the student, and that we want to be sure that they're going to be trained. Do you want to move on, please? Again, we've mentioned the importance of the centre. So it isn't just about your own department. if you come from a new department, you're not going to be discriminated against, but we would then expect you to make wider collaborations. Even if you're the most brilliant researcher in your field, you're going to need a team of people around you to deliver this, likely if it's going to have any relationship to patients in the clinic. We will look at your previous publications and whether they've got anything to do with psoriasis or inflammation or anything that can be seen to relate to what psoriasis patients would regard as important. If you're, we do look favourably upon early research career applications, and you won't be expected to have the same level of publication or standing in the field as some of your more senior peers, and that's okay. Again, it depends on the field, but if you've got a lab project, then having some preliminary data to make us believe that the project is deliverable is extremely helpful, because we know some things can fail at the first hurdle. So to show that you've got something that has got legs really gives us reassurance that things are going to go well. And again, I've touched on this idea that if you come from outside of the psoriasis network, then explain to us what your motivation is for getting involved, and try and highlight your collaborations that will support your work. And these days, the collaborations again depend on the project, but will be clinical, nurses. Have you got the right access to patients? Do you have dedicated clinics if you're doing clinical trials that will support? Then you need all this. If it's non-clinical, then again you've got to show you've got the access to the right equipment and expertise. And increasingly, we need informatics involvement and bioinformatics and training from again your collaborations to make sure that the project is going to be deliverable. And we look particularly favourable if it's a integrated, multi-layer project that brings a number of these things to bear. Next slide, please. Julie touched on this, but we're really very keen and enthusiastic about PPIE. And again, we do not want tokenism. I mean, and we can spot it a mile away. And you've really got to show that patients have been involved from the beginning, that they're going to alter how your project is delivered, that you're going to communicate with them during the project. Again, this is a bit of a bugbear, but if you say on day one, the PI is going to write your ethical committee approval, well, we think that's not very good use of the Psoriasis Association's money, because it's fair enough to wait to know if you've got the studentship, but we would expect the application to have been put in and approved before the project starts, and you should have enough time between the announcement and the outcome or starting the project to deliver this. And I would think that would be something to put in place. And again, if you are involving patients, or even these days lab experiments, you really need to justify why you've chosen the N number. We want to be sure that the outcome are going to be reproducible and reliable, and if it's clinical work, that needs a power calculation. And there will be literature that you can use. You don't always have to have the exact experiment you're proposing to do a power calculation. You can make an assumption that one in the literature is relatively similar, and you would expect the variance to be similar to what you're looking at. Therefore, this is what you've used. And if you say that, that's perfectly reasonable. And in order to support the student, again, they these days need to have an analysis plan, ideally in collaboration with a statistician, particularly if you're doing psychology or epidemiology. So you need to make sure that's built into the supervisory team. So we're not looking necessarily for one PI. There's always a lead PI, but it's more effective to build a team that you can show that there's a number of people supporting the student in doing the work. Okay, shall we move on? Yeah, and I think this is something that's often missing from a studentship. The PI often talks about, well, we will do this and we will do that. I think you have to explain what actually within the project the student will actually do. You know, what field work, what laboratory work, and particularly if this involves a clinical study, and it's a non-clinical PhD studentship, which we usually fund, then what role will the student play? How will the patients be recruited? They're not going to be in a position to recruit the patients. So you need to be able to articulate in the study which bits the student's going to do and which bits they're not going to do, and that you've got the staff on side to be able to do the other aspects for you. And as we've already said, whether this be a clinical study and trial or a lab-based study, is the timeline realistic? Can you see the student getting all this done? We will look at that quite carefully. Next slide then, please. So I think this is the final kind of top tips. And many of the things you will know, it's just that you don't always write them down. So, you know, if you are going to do a study of the psychology of eating different foods in psoriasis, then say, well, at the end of this study, we will know this that we didn't know at the beginning, because that then helps us understand whether you are going to be able to make a difference. And we're very realistic, you know, 3 years in the studentship, you're not going to solve the whole of psoriasis, but you're going to hopefully make a concrete difference to a particular area that you're focusing on. And we'll consider whether the team and the student that you envisage employing will have a good chance of getting this done. And what, you know, and it helps you think about it. If you've got the right outcomes, you can say, well, will this actually be of interest to people with psoriasis? And you can ask them that. And that helps you design your study. And then with all of these grants, as I said at the beginning, I was very fortunate to have people around me to support you, but it isn't just write the draft and send it off. It often requires a bit of honing. You know, is the research question really very carefully explained? Can you improve that? And then there's a knock-on effect then for what happens through. So you often go through a number of iterations, and even as a very experienced grant writer now, I always get my applications peer reviewed, ideally with someone outside the field, so they can say, yeah, you've not quite expressed that bit right. We know what you're trying to get to, but it could be much clearer. And particularly the lay section, you think you've written it in lay, but have you really? Get someone who's a non-expert to read it and give you the feedback. And simple things like avoiding abbreviations for technical terms, that the lay reviewers find that incredibly annoying, particularly if you don't define them. They just, you don't say what it means. And you know, these days with spell check, there's no excuse really for having spelling mistakes. But you know, you do miss it. And again, I have a series of people who read mine, some of which I know are very good at proofreading, others are very good at strategy. So you need more than one person reviewing your application. And you know, having spent however many hours it is to write a grant, these extra couple at the end are really worthwhile, because you just take your application from being, you know, really good to excellent. And even the layout of it, make sure that it's clear with headings, bullet points, so people can follow the flow. And diagrams, I think, are really helpful. You know, they explain the kind of the strategic aims of your grant. So that's probably enough from me. Julie, do you want to finish off with this last bit?
Well, I was just going to say that the last 2 points are things that are really, really close to my heart. Abbreviations and spelling mistakes. If you've got several really quite long, quite complicated grant PhD applications to review, it really puts me in quite a bad temper. If I can't, you know, if I can't understand the abbreviations, I have to go back to the first page to try and understand what these abbreviations are. If it's not nicely laid out, I tell you, if the paragraphs are too long, you know, and they've got all these complicated terms in them, you know, I want to be able to, as Nick said, I want some diagrams. I'd like some, I'm a real bulleted list person. You know, I think your point about what we aim to achieve with this is this, what the PhD student will get out of this is this, and what the difference it will make is this. And that's nice to be in bullets. So I like it to be really readable. I don't want it to be really tiny font. You know, it's just little things like this. As Nick says, he's given you the sort of things that you need to have that are the meat of it. But for me, as a non-academic scientist, I want it to be easily readable. So we're going to close the grant call on the 1st of December. We're having a bit of a debate about paper and email. Apparently it says 15 copies of paper, and Nick and I nearly fell off our chair at the idea of those trees. So I think we're going to have to think about how many. I don't know if we're having a rethink on that, are we, Rhiann?
So we've lowered the amount of paper copies. Everyone will be pleased to hear. We can't get rid of paper copies yet. We are working towards that. One of the barriers we have is that our exec committee, we don't want to put barriers in place, and not everyone, I know it sounds, not everyone actually has a computer at home. So some people in our exec committee ask for paper copies because their internet access is at the library or on their phone. So we've minimised the number of paper copies required, and we're hoping to keep reducing it. But at the moment, we know that there's at least a few members of our exec committee that can't review electronically.
Okay, that's fine. Well, that's okay, Nick, isn't it? We're happy with that, but we're keeping that under review. So your closing date is the 1st of December, and then between December and February, Rhiann collates everything. She sends it out to us, so it goes out to the Experts by Experience Committee. It will go out to Nick and I and the Research Committee, and also the external peer reviewers. And then between February and March, Rhiann will collate all of the comments and the scores. This is a big job for the research assistant, and a very important job. We all will comment. We have a sheet of paper, and we will actually score it based on things like, do we think, one of the questions is, do we think this research is necessary? Yes or no. Now, if all of the panel says, no, this research is not necessary, then you're not going to be going very far. But if everybody puts, yeah, this is a great idea, then that's a good start. We'll then score it on, I think it's a 0 to 5 scale. And by and large, what we find is that the PhDs that we consider at our committee meeting, when we've got everything collated, are ones that score 3 and above. And often if it scores less, if the average collated score is less than 3, it is unusual that it would be brought to the committee. And then we meet in March, and at that time applications will be discussed in the light of those compiled comments and the scores. And at the end of that meeting, we will make a recommendation which we take to the next trustees meeting. By and large, we fund 2. Helen's not here to say, but we usually fund 2. And if we got 3 really good applications, we might fund 3. So it's 2 or 3. In previous years, we've considered as many as 6 or 7 at our meeting that have scored highly. The COVID years have been a bit leaner. with a fewer number, and last year we didn't have quite as many, which is one of the reasons we thought we would do this workshop, to try and encourage people to reflect on applications if they've applied before and not been successful, to try and help and encourage people to apply, but maybe change their application a little bit in the context of what we've said today. And it's usually the April trustees meeting when we make a final decision and we let everybody know.